This is a Dutch testing report tutorial. Please do keep in mind these videos are for educational information only, not intended to be medical advice. The results that we're actually showing here are just examples, not intended to be any particular patient's results. So there's a lot of information to look at with respect to cortisol. The primary information that we want to focus on is the pattern of free cortisol over time, as well as the total production. So when we look at free cortisol, we've got four measurements. We've got the waking sample, which don't take that as a waking cortisol, right? It's a waking urine sample, which reflects the night's collection of cortisol. So that's cortisol while you're sleeping, essentially. Then this morning sample is from the first 2 hours of the day. There's supposed to be a big morning surge of cortisol, and we want to see if that's there. Then there's an afternoon sample, at which point the cortisol is returned back down quite a bit, and then its lowest point around bedtime. So that's the free cortisol. You want to look at this and evaluate this for dysfunction in terms of the pattern itself and in terms also of the total. So when you look at all four, we're looking at the free cortisol for the entire day. Now in this particular case, it's within the normal range, but on the lower side. So there's a reasonable amount of free cortisol, but it's on the lower side. That is not a good marker for cortisol production, however, and this particular case is a good example of this, because the free cortisol represents about 1% of the total output of cortisol. Okay, it's the most important fraction because it's the free bioavailable fraction able to get into a cell and do something. But the metabolized cortisol is the best marker for total cortisol, the gland's total production. Okay, and when we look at that, this particular patient is relatively high, so there's actually a lot of cortisol being made. So what does that mean? Well, as cortisol is made by the adrenal gland in response to ACTH, ACTH is the signaling hormone from the brain to the adrenal gland, then we make cortisol, and then it circulates. But it doesn't circulate entirely as cortisol. It also can go back and forth to its inactive form called cortisone, and there's an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD that flips it back and forth. Okay, so because it flips back and forth so much, we don't just want to look at the cortisol picture, we also want to look at cortisone as it's of secondary importance, but it helps to confirm that up and down pattern of what's really going on at the four different time points during the day. But that is all free cortisol, and that is all a very small fraction of the total that's produced. Most of what's produced is metabolized to cortisol and cortisone metabolites. Not cortisol and cortisone, but tetrahydrocortisone, tetrahydrocortisol. These are the end products that end up getting excreted in the urine, and that's what's made out of cortisol and cortisone. So in a case like this, we've got a low normal result overall for the free cortisol, but a relatively high result in terms of the overall production. So what does that imply? That implies that potentially cortisol metabolism is upregulated. What upregulates that? Obesity, excess thyroid, potentially long-term exposure to cortisol, long-term exposure to cortisol-like medicines, like prednisone or some sort of glucocorticoid. If there's long-term exposure to that, if there's a history of that, it potentially could upregulate the body's ability to get rid of cortisol. On the other side of it, which we don't see here, but if you see the opposite of that, where the production is relatively low and the free cortisol is relatively high, that would imply low cortisol metabolism or sluggish cortisol metabolism, which you'll see with low thyroid cases, poor liver function, that sort of a thing. So we've looked at the free cortisol, we've checked the free cortisone a little bit, we're looking at the total production. The other issue that you can have here that will drive potentially down or up the cortisol at different times is overall in this back and forth metabolism between active cortisol and inactive cortisone, is there an overall preference? And it's tempting to just look up here at the free cortisol or the total of the free cortisol and cortisone to see which one sort of predominates. But what the scientific literature would suggest is that the best way to ask that question is to look at the metabolites of cortisol and cortisone, not the free hormone, because these represent such a larger fraction of the total that's made. So you want to look at that value and see, is there a preference for cortisol to stay in its active form, or is there a heavy deactivation to cortisol? So you can evaluate that by looking at that gauge there at the bottom, which again is a weight of which do we have more of, cortisol or cortisone metabolites, and that rounds out the picture. Free cortisol over time, the total of production, and then any metabolic preference that we may have. So I hope that's been helpful. We do have more educational videos you can see at dutchtest.com. From a patient perspective, if you have specific questions on your results, please do see your healthcare provider for those, and we thank you for testing with us.